All right, in the last part 3, we talked about ATP production and chemiosmosis. In this part 4, we're going to wrap up our discussion on cell respiration. We're going to be talking about fermentation. So glycolysis produces ATP in the absence of oxygen, and what it does is it kind of keeps the cell alive, so to speak, in the absence of oxygen. Okay, and there's a lot of organisms that can rely solely on glycolysis for energy production. Of course, we and many other animals cannot, but there's another process that some of these organisms use as well to kind of keep glycolysis going, to keep them alive, and that's fermentation. Okay, and fermentation occurs in a couple of different types that we're going to talk about: lactic acid fermentation, alcohol fermentation, and some of them are exclusively used to keep organisms alive in the absence of oxygen, and others just kind of assist with the process of keeping organisms alive. And with glycolysis, what we're going to do is we're going to generate pyruvate, and pyruvate has no way to get into the mitochondrion, and therefore, especially if oxygen is not available, I should say, and it's got no way to get into the mitochondrion. And as a result of that, is if we can continue to make NAD plus, which is one of kind of the starting reactants of this, then we can keep glycolysis going. If we don't, if we use up all of the NAD plus that you see here, whoops, let me get this, all of the NAD plus that you get here, then the reaction is going to stop. Okay, so during the process of glycolysis, the NAD plus H plus here is going to give us NADH. And we have to have a way to use this to get this back so that we can keep the process going, because in addition to this, we're giving us some ATP, which is what the cell is going to be able to use to keep us alive. Okay, so we're going to kind of go through and explain how this does. And the key point here is that fermentation is going to continue to allow glycolysis to continue. Okay, so if we look here, here's the process that we were just describing. And what we have is glucose getting turned into the pyruvate. Okay, and in the process of alcohol fermentation, an example would be yeast using this. There's a whole series of reactions that's going to occur that's going to give us this alcohol right here. Okay, so in the process, we're going to produce a little bit of CO2. The NADH that's being produced is going to become the NAD, which is going to allow glycolysis to continue, making more ATP, and then the process is just going to complete. And as a result, we're going to continually make the ethanol. Okay, so this is the way the alcohol production can occur with grapes, say, to make wine using some yeast and such. If you've ever noticed that bread kind of has like an alcohol-y smell or a beery smell, when you're letting bread rise, this process takes place, and of course the baking process bakes all of the alcohol out. But again, you're using yeast to allow the flour and the sugar and things like that, and allowing the dough to rise. And as a result of that, you're making a small amount of alcohol or ethanol. And that's because this glucose in this fermentation process is producing alcohol, but it's a way to keep the yeast alive. Okay? So now with lactic acid fermentation, if you went out and ran really, really quickly, your cells would be starved of oxygen. Of course, you'd still be breathing, but your cells would be starved of oxygen. And as a result of that, what's going on is since the cells are starved of oxygen, pyruvate's having a hard time getting into the mitochondria. Okay? And as a result of that, it's starting to back up, and glycolysis is starting to slow down, or would otherwise start to slow down if we didn't have a way to take this NADH that's being produced and run it back into the NAD, and then that NAD is going to go through glycolysis with us to generate more ATP. And as a result of this process, your cells are going to begin to produce lactic acid, because that pyruvate on its when NAD plus is being regenerated, the pyruvate is getting converted to lactate, and that's what's being stored in your muscles. And that's why, like, when you get sore, it's good to move around, to exercise more, to get the blood flowing, to get that lactic acid washed out of your cells, get it to the liver where it can get processed and broken down. Okay, so as far as glycolysis is concerned, the reason it's so important, just kind of as an aside here, the evolutionary significance is many ancient prokaryotes likely used glycolysis before oxygen was present in the atmosphere, because, of course, glycolysis doesn't require any oxygen. And the oldest fossils known, really are about 3.5 billion years old, and they had to kind of evolve in the absence of oxygen because all of the oxygen produced is of biological origin, or very nearly all of it, as a result of photosynthesis, and that began accumulating in the atmosphere about 2.7 billion years ago. So there was a long period of time that had occurred between the first living organisms and the actual presence of oxygen. Okay, glycolysis is very widespread. It's the most widespread form of energy production. All organisms have this. The location in the cytosol, so bacteria who don't have any cell or membrane bound organelles, they perform glycolysis, and that's in their cytosol, so you don't need any membrane bound organelles for this, which is also indicative of something that was evolved very early on. Okay, so now just the last thing here, dealing with catabolism, or the actual breaking down of food. We've been discussing glucose as a way to, as the food source, but just know that all types of energy that we're consuming as a result of our diet, whether it's proteins, whether it's fats, carbohydrates, things like that, these things can get broken down into kind of intermediates that can be used by cellular respiration. Okay, so proteins can be used as a fuel, of course, and what we have to do is we have to remove that amino group, combine it with some CO2, turn it into urea, and get rid of it with our urinary system, the kidneys and such. But these intermediates can get fed into the glycolysis and the TCA cycle, or the Krebs cycle, and help us generate some food, or some ATP energy from that food. Fat catabolism, breaking down of fats, produces lots and lots of energy, and it's important to know that proteins and carbs each have 4 calories, I should say, per gram. So say 4 calories per gram, whereas fats have 9 calories per gram. Okay, so you can see that fats have a lot more energy in their bonds, contained within their bonds, potential energy in their bonds, than either proteins or carbohydrates do. And when your body breaks these things down, it's very easy to see how this all occurs. Now, this is nothing that you need to memorize or know. It's just illustrating the point that as we take these, this is a molecule of fat here. As we start to break this down, you can see we're generating some FADH2, which is an electron carrier, which can go to the electron transport chain, drop off the electrons, and help generate 2 ATPs. Breaking this down here, when we get to here, there's some NADH, which generates 3. Acetyl-CoA, of course, can get funneled into cell respiration and generate 3 NADH2s. It can generate 3 NADHs, 1 FADH2, and a couple of ATPs. Okay, the FADH2 again gets more ATP, so if you were to look all the way along here, there's all sorts of intermediates that can get funneled into cell respiration and the chemiosmosis and generate lots and lots of ATP molecules. So as a result of just this one fat molecule that you see right here, we're getting 7 FADH2s, okay, 7 NADHs, and 8 acetyl-CoAs, and each of these now get funneled into processes that produce a large amount of ATP. Okay, so now as far as anabolic metabolism goes, just being able to use this food for energy, some of what we ingest gets diverted away from glycolysis, and it's used, or glycolysis, and it's used to kind of build up and repair certain things in our cells. So some of the food in our diet, like proteins, help build muscle, help repair muscle, help with production of enzymes and things like that. So with our anabolic, or our build-up metabolism, a lot of the food that we're consuming isn't necessarily going to be used to generate ATP, but it's going to be used for growth and repair. Okay, so that wraps up part 4, and if you have any questions, make sure that you write them down. We'll be sure to discuss them in class. All right, we'll see you soon.